welcome to today's webinar all about Generation Alpha, the new kids of America and the future consumers in the US. My name is Laura and I lead the US Trends team here at GWI. I'm super excited to be sharing this webinar with you all today about this next generation. So what's coming up for you all today? I have a very short intro to GWI to those of you who might be less familiar with who we are, and a little bit of an explanation into our GWI Kids dataset. And then we'll get on to the fun part and why you've all joined me today. I have some overarching data to share with you about the US Gen Alpha consumer in 2022. And then I have 4 key areas to share with you about where Gen Alpha are making the most impact. What they like in terms of entertainment, how they feel about social media, what parents are saying about protecting their kids online, and lastly, a snapshot into the world of gaming. If anyone has any questions or comments on today's session, please feel free to drop them into the chat and we'll be sure to answer any messages via email after today's session. I'll also be sharing our Trends team contact info at the end of the webinar for anyone who would like to reach out to myself and our wonderful team of analysts. Or alternatively, you can send a note to the email within the information bar on your web browser. So we've got lots to cover today. So before we move on to the research, I'd like to give you a very quick overview of who we are at GWI. For anyone who's unfamiliar, we're a target audience company that provides consumer insights to leading brands, marketing agencies, and media organizations worldwide. We're also home to the world's largest survey on the digital consumer. We make our global data available through our intuitive subscription-based platform, which allows clients to dive in and cross-analyze different data points and audiences to better understand consumers. Our global core survey covers 50 countries. We do over 1 million interviews a year, and we have 8 data sets that specify a range of industries and markets such as sports, gaming, work, or unique surveys such as our USA data set for the American market. For the purposes of this presentation, I'll be focusing on our GWI Kids data set. GWI Kids is a comprehensive study of internet users aged 8 to 15 across 16 different markets. Now, for the purposes of this session, I'll be focusing primarily on just the US, but I do have some world comparisons to share with you all as well. This survey is done by interviewing both children and their parents or guardians, and this allows us to see a complete picture of a child's actions and opinions, as well as the context in which they live. It runs once a year, and our latest wave was released this year in Q1 2022. I'm sure I don't have to tell any of you that interviewing children is very different to interviewing adults. So our GWI Kids questionnaire is very unique from our other surveys. The majority of questions are asked to all children, but some are asked differently to 8 to 11-year-olds and 12 to 15-year-olds. The questions asked to younger respondents tend to be simpler and contain fewer options. Additionally, age-appropriate options are provided for each age group. Both age groups are given clear instructions throughout the survey, and they're not asked to complete any questions that may be hard to answer. For instance, all contextual questions on ethnicity, income, and gender are directed to their parents or guardians instead. We ask kids about a range of topics. Questions can be about what they usually do after school, to picking their favorite movie character. This wide range of data within our questionnaire content allows us to tap into specific interests that kids have and gain insights about them at a deeper level. Okay, so now you know a little bit more about us and our GWI Kids data set. And although our GWI Kids survey is one of our newer data sets, we've been able to see some really compelling insights trending over time to give you all today a snapshot into these future consumers. So let's talk about Generation Alpha. Generation Alpha are predicted to be the biggest and most diverse generation yet. The youngest of this generation were born during a pandemic, and some of the eldest of Gen Alpha share their birth year with the iPad, a device that could well become synonymous with this generation. They also belong to the fastest growing family unit, one-child families. We've seen the biggest increase in the number of only children compared to last year, with only child families growing by 45%. And some of you may be familiar with hearing kids today referred to as mini millennials. And in our data, over half of Gen Alpha are born of millennial parents. While Gen Alpha might share some views of millennials and Gen Z, that's those that we survey aged 16 to 24, Alphas do have very distinct opinions of their own. Gen Alpha literally grew up surrounded by technology, tech far more advanced than Gen Z, who we call digital natives. And these digital experiences for Gen Alpha have really influenced their everyday life, not to mention the last 2 years as well with the pandemic. So we're seeing a new kind of consumer form, one that we've really never experienced before. We know from our research that health and wellness has become more important to adults during the pandemic, and to no surprise, kids have been affected too. So what has it looked like for kids growing up during COVID? Now, we've organized our data here by percentage change since Q1 2021. Concerns about their health are understandably top of mind. We've seen a 16% increase since last year. With worries about getting their family ill on the rise, 29% of 12 to 15-year-olds would also describe themselves as health conscious. In addition to this, something unique to the US is the increased concern with not seeing their family enough. In the last 2 years, many parents were able to take advantage of self-isolation, taking the opportunity to turn lockdown into family bonding time. Compared to the rest of the world, we've actually seen the opposite for Gen Alpha in the US, where worries about not seeing their family enough have increased by 14% since last year. Contrasts like this show that transitions after COVID-19 for Gen Alpha in the US will continue to present challenges. Yes, to their attitudes towards health and wellness, but also to their family priorities too. Although worries remain, we are seeing some optimistic shifts. Where we've seen the most amount of decreases at the bottom of the chart here are for worries about the future, not seeing friends enough, or falling behind at school, where we've seen the biggest decrease. And we know that as schools have begun to reopen, some obviously opting for hybrid learning as well, we've seen the big emphasis on feeling less worried about their education. For US 12 to 15s, getting good grades remains the top attitude towards school, and 43% believe it's important to go to college. This is really solidifying ambitions that Gen Alpha want to do well in their studies, both now and in the future. But what about how Gen Alpha view the world? Well, when we look at some of the attitudes that are important to them, the top 3 are all centered around looking out for one another. And these percentages are much higher than kids in the rest of the world. That's the ROW key on this page in the pink. Gen Alpha in the US have grown up in a world where there's been increased animosity, particularly in recent years, strong divides of opinions across the US on a sweeping range of topics, from the pandemic politics, the environment, protecting people's rights. This has all been front and center of American debate, and some big discussions have played out that while they may not have been directly impacted to Gen Alpha, would certainly have impacted their families. Many children across America have had their mental health impacted by the pandemic, catapulted into a world that has meant for many the loss not only of a portion of their childhood, but the loss of a parent or caregiver too. So in line with their worries about not seeing their family enough, these attitudes towards advocating for others shows a priority of activism for others. Helping people is the #1 priority for 12 to 15s. And just over half want to protect people from bullying and for everyone to be treated the same. The experiences Gen Alpha have had, even in just the last year, are fueling long-lasting attitudes that are about trying to create a safer world for everyone. And we'll see some of these core beliefs and attitudes play out in how they respond and react to other areas as well. For US teens, we're also seeing differences to the rest of the world where American girls are not only feeling more empowered, but they're also striving for monetary success. Ranking higher in attitudes that express a desire for a career in any industry they want, links to fame, and that being successful means earning lots of money compared to the other 15 markets that we survey. 63% of US teen girls say that girls can do any job they want to, compared to 46% in the rest of the world, solidifying a strong sense of ambition for girls in the US. So how are Gen Alpha staying entertained? Spoiler alert, it's got a lot to do with screen time. Now, I want to today look at, in particular, just how the pandemic has impacted the young beyond what we've seen through their implications on their health. There is no sign of screen time slowing down in the US. American Gen Alphas use an average of 4 devices a week, and 45% of them use 5 or more social networks. Screen time for Gen Alpha in the US differs to kids in the rest of the world. This contrast is most dramatic when comparing usage of devices and the internet. These charts here show how heavy screen time in the US has increased compared to the rest of the world. In the US, parents now report that their children use devices and the internet much more frequently in the last year, compared to the rest of the world, where we've seen an increase in light usage. So this usage is most notable when you compare heavy usage. So looking at heavy usage in the US, there's been a 16% increase compared to a 19% decrease for the rest of the world. You can also just see this very easily visually represented here, the left side being the US, where our chart lines are trending upwards, whereas our ROW, rest of world chart shows a decline in this trend over time. And these are for both devices in the blue and internet usage in the white. Now, even though we've seen a big increase in screen time, it's not all about the smaller screen. The movie theater is making a comeback. We've seen a 39% increase in US 12 to 15s who say the movie theater is their favorite way to watch movies, a higher number than the global average. This could also be due to the fact that kids have a lot of enthusiasm for seeing a movie the moment it's released. 46% of US 12 to 15 say they like to watch a movie as soon as it comes out, a 9% increase since last year. And it's a sentiment that aligns with kids around the world too. But what I also think is surprising here is the rise of audio content. The last 2 data points here reference the increase in listening to and interest in podcasts, where we've seen increases to both. As listening time and interests in podcasts increases, Gen Alpha understands the importance of taking time away from looking at their devices. For Gen Alpha, comedy is a top genre for podcasts, but close behind comedy are educational and storytelling genres, suggesting that Gen Alpha are engaged in this type of content to learn new things and energize their creativity. So even while surrounded by screens, Gen Alpha still has time to switch off and be entertained by simply listening. Now, coming back to those values I mentioned earlier about helping people, protecting people from bullying, and everyone being treated the same, those attitudes are being reflected in their wants and needs to what they see on screen. 3 in 10 US teens believe it's important to see all types of people in TV shows and movies. And when you start to break down their demographic backgrounds, it's even more interesting to see where representation matters. Now, I don't really anticipate that this should be surprising to anyone, but what I think these numbers do here is add even more fuel to the fire of just how important representation is in media and entertainment. When breaking out into these 3 races and ethnicities of Black, African American, Hispanic, and white Caucasian, compared to white characters like Anna from Frozen, where white Caucasian kids say they like them the most, look at where interest is for characters like Miguel from Coco and Mirabel from Encanto. They are much higher in the ranks for kids who are Hispanic. Even interest in characters like Tiana dips for white Caucasian children against Black and Hispanic kids. If you're unfamiliar with the enormous success Encanto had during its release, the song We Don't Talk About Bruno, a character in the movie, was a major musical hit globally. It reached #1 in the US Billboard Hot 100 list, and it did the same around the world. And I'm sure the lyrics were stuck in the heads of many parents across the US as well. But the success of Encanto isn't only down to Lin-Manuel Miranda's ability to create memorable music. It's about the family that it represents. Remember that value of everyone being treated the same? Kids want to see themselves. Seeing characters that resemble themselves or their family will likely drive more engagement in the future, as we can expect these young consumers to be drawn to those who look like them. And for kids to put greater emphasis on the equal treatment and representation of characters from all kinds of backgrounds. Moving on to social media. Gen Alpha are undoubtedly growing up in a world surrounded by tech. We all know this, but not just any tech. Devices, apps, platforms, they all evolve at speed, much greater speed compared to what Gen Z grew up with during the late 90s and early 2000s. It doesn't really compare to what we see today, and Gen Alpha are beginning to notice the effects. Gen Alpha in the US are relatively active social media users. Looking at the data points here, they typically do a lot of what you would expect kids to do on social media. Compared to the global average, US teens are 41% more likely to say they post everything they do, and they're 14% more likely to say it makes them feel closer to their friends. But since last year, we've seen decreases in social media users aged 12 to 15 in how they think, feel, and interact with social media platforms. If you look at the percentage changes, you'll see that every black dot that represents this year, Q1 2022, is lower than in the pink showing 2021. So every data point has seen a decrease since last year. There's a lot of talk about passive engagement for kids on social media and an equally strong awareness of the negative impacts that spending hours scrolling through social networks has. We've seen significant decreases in responses to "it makes me feel good about myself" or "I can say what I really think." But this doesn't mean that these negative effects and feelings for Gen Alpha are making them switch off. In fact, the opposite is happening. Globally, we've seen kids start to spend more time with their friends in person. Not for kids in the US. We've seen a 26% increase in 12 to 15 saying they spend the most time using social media after school since 2021, and a 71% increase on the weekends. And as Gen Alpha spends more time online, we're seeing a shift in the types of content they're drawn to. Spurred on by social media attitudes from Gen Z, the momentum of a filterless world has created a new aesthetic of authenticity, which also seems to be catching the attention of kids too. 4 in 10 teens in the US say watching live streams is a main reason for using social media. Now, we can't talk about social media here without mentioning the huge impact of TikTok. Live streamed and authentic content exists on this platform, and many other platforms have followed suit. For many users of TikTok, the content you see and hear will categorize what side of the app you're on, leading users to have very different experiences. So even with the most unique of interests, from foodie talk to frog talk, there seems to be something for everyone. And subcultures like these, along with TikTok's very nature of a more unfiltered platform, feels much more free than the curated lives of other social media platforms. And you can see this beginning to have an effect on some of their other attitudes towards social media. Gen Alpha are far less interested in celebrities and influencers than they were last year, but they're also less likely to be interested in sharing themselves online too. The greatest challenge for Gen Alpha online is the fear of missing out. After spending so much time away from their peers due to the pandemic, FOMO has become a major concern for Gen Alpha. But if you consider their increased screen time with less concerns about not seeing their friends anymore, this demonstrates a stronger sense of adaptability for kids in the US. More screens may be having negative implications, but they're not worried about not seeing their friends anymore, an activity they do a lot of when they're online. American Gen Alpha seems to be better at hybrid communication. They demonstrate a flexibility in how they approach their relationships, one which we might continue to see as these consumers communicate online more in the future. After talking about screen time and social media, it only seems fair to nod to the effects that parents are noticing too. So this next section is all about keeping kids safe online. Data privacy is a big concern for everyone on the internet, but it becomes particularly concerning when looking at how the youngest consumers interact online. As kidfluencer culture continues to be challenged, how are parents reacting to their kids' lives on the internet? Parents in the US are far more likely to open up communication with their kids on privacy matters than those within the rest of the world. This open communication is apparent when Gen Alpha thinks about their own safety online. 65% of US 12 to 15-year-olds say they know how to be safe online, increasing 6% since last year. And a majority of kids also say their parents know what they do online as well. For parents in the US, monitoring their children's online actions is a far greater practice than parents in the rest of the world. By either looking at websites and apps they use or giving their children access to their accounts, these parents have a window into their kids' online behaviors. And you can see some of these behaviors here with how more frequently parents will say they set up parental controls and monitor websites versus using time limits. This chart here also indicates some big rest of world differences. If you take a look at options like accessing accounts, speaking to me about privacy, or monitoring websites or apps used, they're all much higher than the rest of the world. Compare this to time limits, the data point here at the end of the chart, the rest of the world leads in that regard. But the responsibility shouldn't solely rest on the role of parents and guardians to keep kids safe online. The internet wasn't created with kids in mind, but as many more are spending an increased amount of time online, brands can offer educational practices to those who are. Interland is an online adventure game developed by Google, aiming to teach kids to consider their digital interactions. Brands can use Interland as a source of inspiration to help parents and kids continue to be aware in the digital world. Parental supervision varies depending on the age group. And this chart here shows the split between 8 to 11s and 12 to 15s who use these types of devices unsupervised. The biggest increase for 8 to 11s since last year is with smart TVs. That's the last data point on this slide in the light pink. With streaming services increasing, introducing parental controls alongside their more mature content offering gives parents peace of mind. But even when you look at each of these devices, supervision is declining across the board on phones, games consoles, and tablets too. The incline that we see here on this chart refers to kids using these devices unsupervised. So supervision has decreased. Brands that enable parents to control what their kids watch allows them to take a step back. As Gen Alpha gets older, there's equally an opportunity for parents to begin to build trust with their teens, especially when it comes to privacy. And there are opportunities for brands to enter this market space with Gen Alpha in mind. Many brands offer detailed age-based guidelines on what and when to control kids' internet use, but ultimately, not everything is under parents' control, and we'll likely see not only brands performing in this space, but US legislation playing a big part in this too. With bills like the Kids Online Safety Act, we could see more instances like these that not only make supervision easier for parents, but bring safety on the internet to the front of conversation, particularly when we think about how Gen Alpha uses their devices and the internet. Our last section today is all about the world of gaming, because we couldn't leave today without talking about just how much games have an impact on kids, especially for Gen Alpha within the digital space. So how does Gen Alpha interact with gaming and the digital experience? Gaming is by far the most popular activity for US Gen Alpha and a dominant part of their digital lives. Gaming is significantly higher for Gen Alpha in the US. 41% of US Gen Alpha play games every day, compared to only 23% of kids in the rest of the world. The majority of kids find out about new video games through their friends or family members. But as Gen Alpha get older, 12 to 15s are likely to find out about new video games by hearing people talk about them on social media. This enables gamers to give feedback in a forum-style setting, which we know Gen Alpha are drawn to with their increased interest in sites like Discord. You might think that mobile phones would be the biggest gaming advocate, but games consoles still come out on top for gamers in the US. For kids in the US, games consoles hold the #1 spot year over year. And with increased usage of games consoles since last year, there seems to be no signs of this slowing down. In addition to consoles beating mobile phones, we're also seeing a decline in interest in Gen Alpha using a laptop or computer for gaming. And we've seen similar trends with US adults too. Among 16 to 64s, both PCs and laptops have seen a 15% decrease in engagement since Q4 2020. We've seen shifts in gaming content too. The biggest games we've seen increase in popularity since last year are Roblox and Fortnite. It might come as a surprise for some to know that Roblox was actually released in 2006. So it was a well-established platform by the time Gen Alpha began to come of age. And Fortnite, released in 2017, has a similar style of gaming to Roblox, and both these games' sudden rise in popularity is a result of shifts in attitudes that we've seen Gen Alpha have to gaming. Building and creating has seen the biggest increase since last year, increasing 30% in interest. Gaming also gives kids the opportunity to spend their money. Thinking about Gen Alphas as future consumers, 1/3 of 12 to 15s have a bank or savings account they can access. And with over 1 in 5 interested in items they can buy in video games, the freedom to choose skins, avatars, and other gaming accessories unlocked by purchases are a key driver for young consumers. Spending money through online transactions in games could also shape how kids will spend as adults. As social media shopping continues to grow, we can expect more digital transactions across a number of platforms for these young consumers in the future. We know Gen Alpha in the US love gaming, and they're just as likely to play by themselves as with friends. But for these young gamers, the social component of gaming outranks playing alone. Playing video games became a much needed lifeline for young adults during the pandemic. And for the youngest consumers, video games are also seen as an opportunity to be social. 57% of US gamers aged 8 to 11 talk to their friends online when they play games. And as Gen Alpha are now witnessing some serious shifts in technology with NFTs, cryptocurrency, and blockchain all under this roof of the metaverse, this deepening of social interactions online is beginning to shape a new phase of online participation. Gen Alpha has embraced the ever-changing digital community, and ultimately, brands will need to make sure contributions to their online worlds not only meet the needs of the consumers of tomorrow, but to keep up with them too. So we are almost at the end of today's session, but I want to leave you all with some key takeaways before we end today's webinar. So first up is that kids feel confident about the classroom. Even though worries are still impacting kids about the pandemic, and they might be more health conscious now than they were before, concerns about not seeing friends enough and falling behind in school have all decreased since last year, with the biggest change being fewer worries about their education. Screen time shows no signs of slowing down. Compared to kids in the rest of the world, screen time for Gen Alpha in the US has soared. But remember, Gen Alpha in the US seem to be better at hybrid communication. They demonstrate a flexibility in how they approach their relationships, one which we may see continue as these consumers communicate online more in the future. And even though they're looking at screens more, audio content is on the rise. Gen Alpha are tuning into their well-being and taking time away from looking at their devices, because sometimes listening is better than looking. Representation really matters to them. I just want to add more fuel to the fire here. Representation is so important. Even in our USA dataset, we see huge impactful relevance in our DE&I studies. Diversity and inclusion for these future consumers and seeing characters that resemble themselves is a huge point of interest and engagement for them. That's not going to go away. And lastly, Gen Alpha are embracing the digital world. You might say, well, of course they are, because it's all they've ever known, but Gen Alpha expresses a highly adaptable attitude between real life and digital worlds, expanding on hybrid forms of social and financial interactions. Exactly how Gen Alpha will participate in the metaverse remains to be seen. But if one thing is for certain, exploration in Web3 will continue, and these future consumers will be sure to find ways to dive deeper, while also maybe making everyone feel a little bit older in the process. But hopefully I've equipped you all with some knowledge today that you can take away and know that you understand Generation Alpha just a little bit better than you did at the start of today's webinar. And that concludes today's session. I really hope that you all found this webinar interesting and informative, and that you take away some deeper knowledge of exactly who Gen Alpha are as they continue to grow to be future consumers in the US. Thank you all so much for joining today. We'll be sending you the recording and slides from this webinar so you can review today's content in your own time. And if anyone has any questions about today's session, or you'd like more information about what we do here at GWI, please feel free to reach out to myself and our wonderful trends team to the email which is on screen now. Thanks, everyone.